Hello, welcome to Female Racers of the 20th Century. I'm Casey Johnson with the Legacy of the Lakes Museum, and I will be your presenter for this evening. This is the second of our series in A Woman's Place from our History at Home series, and it's in honor of Women's History Month. This is a collaborative effort between the Douglas County Historical Society, the Legacy of the Lakes Museum and Gardens, and the Runestone Museum Foundation. We also partnered with Alexandria Community Education. And then without further ado, let's dive right on. So I'm going to give you guys an idea of what early motor racing looked like before we dive on into the female racers. And the first races were really occurring between automobiles, but they were later joined by airplanes and motorboats. The first recorded race is in 1867 England, and it was between two men driving self-propelled vehicles on an 8-mile road. In the United States, in 1878 in Wisconsin, it was a similar situation. It was two men racing. This had been open to more competitors, but only two signed up. However, the first official organized race that had a large number of entrants was in 1894, and it was from Paris to Rouen. It was organized by Le Petit Journal and featured horseless carriages, as they were called, and it was meant to prove that they were safe, easy to drive, and cheaper than the alternative being horse carriages. Of 102 entrants, they narrowed that down to just 25 competitors. Then you start to see motorboat racing as more and more advancements are made in boat speed capabilities. So as the speed increased, naturally there were competitions that followed. The first official race of motorboats was in 1903 England, and it was the Harmsworth Trophy race. And it featured American and European competitors, but the Harmsworth Trophy was won by England. In the United States, the first official race was in 1904 on the Hudson River, and boat speeds were just under 20 miles per hour. In the 30 years from this date, though, boats would be going over 100 miles per hour. So there was definitely a lot of increased speed happening and quick advancements. Next, we want to look at a woman's place in this rising world of motor racing. So the rise of motor racing coincides with three distinct eras of history. They are the Victorian Age, the Progressive Era, and the Jazz Age. The Victorian Age is where we have this idea of the cult of domesticity, and women were supposed to stay in the home. They raised the kids, the husband was second in command only to God and authority, and so they really weren't expected to go out and do much of anything besides keep the home and keep on producing the next generation. They could dabble in charity, but it was very taboo for them to seek employment. Now again, when we're talking about this, we're talking mostly about upper class and middle class women. We all know that lower classes were working the entire time while still being expected to maintain the cult of domesticity. So it was kind of this juxtaposition there. Then you move into the Progressive Era, and this is really where you start to see more opportunities for women. So there's more education, more chances for employment, and more chances to be involved in sports, as well as calls for suffrage and equal protection under the law. Now, again, upper class women, though, were still kind of beholden to this cult of domesticity idea, but in the middle and lower, it was a little bit more freeing in that sense. And then you look at the Jazz Era, which you really see large rebellion among the younger women, the younger generations. With World War I, they had kind of gotten a taste for independence because all the men were off fighting, and so women, even in World War I, were working in munitions factories, and so they had a taste of it and didn't want to go back to the pre-war ideals of womanhood. So that's kind of where you see women entering more and more places where they wouldn't traditionally be seen. And again, women in upper classes, though, still held on to those original Victorian ideals of society because it was seen as a way to distinguish between the upper classes and the lower classes. Obviously, at this time, classes were being blurred, and so what's one way they maintained it? Well, we have manners. That was their idea. So the Great Equalizer. Women have been participating in motorsports since they began. They were certainly in lower numbers than men, but they were definitely involved. Women previously had not been allowed to go out unchaperoned, and it was difficult for them to travel from place to place. And this could be they would have somebody driving them, they would have to have a maid accompanying them, just all these different barriers for them to move. But as more advancements occurred in transportation, such as the bicycle, streetcars, things like that, women gained more independence. Planes, automobiles, and boats were great equalizers between men and women in this arena because they didn't require impressive strength to operate. It leveled the playing field. It did not stop men from discouraging female participants or even barring them from competing entirely, but they still were able to compete just as well, if not better, than men. The first organized race of female competitors was between 8 women on a horse track going around in motorized tricycles in France. And then you see but that was again just among women. So the first woman to compete against men in an international competition was the Baroness Helene von Zuylen of the Rothschild family. And she was the first woman to compete in an international race against men, and that was from Paris to Amsterdam and then back to Paris. Part of the reason she was able to compete in this race was because her husband was one of the organizers of it, and so she was able to get in on that. And many people didn't even know that there was a woman competing. She went under the name Snail. That was her pseudonym for racing. And unfortunately, we don't know what place she finished in because they only recorded the first 15 finishers, and she wasn't one of the first 15. So we're not sure where she finished, but she was the first. So something we've briefly touched on already, and something that you're going to see recurring as we move through this presentation, is that these women all have one thing in common, and that's that they were very wealthy. All of the highlighted women we're talking about either were born into or married into wealth. And that's because racing is an extremely expensive sport. It still is today. For example, when Garwood, if you caught our previous History at Home last month, Garwood, when he went to England to race in the Harmsworth Trophy, it cost him $250,000 to get there, which is about equivalent to buying power of $3.5 million today. So it is not something to be taken on lightly. Women of upper social classes also benefited from having higher status and public perception. They were often written off as eccentric rather than breaking social rules and ridiculed. And lower classes were shamed for participating in more masculine pursuits, and often a lower class woman wouldn't want to jeopardize her livelihood by participating in something that was going to earn her some ridicule. So wealth definitely has its privileges. And then moving on, we're going to go on to our ladies of the hour. So our first woman we're looking at is called Camille Dugast. She was known as one of the richest and most accomplished widows in France. She was born in 1868 and was described as a tomboy as a child, and she married a department store magnate named Jules Crispin, and they had one daughter, and she was widowed by the age of 27. She used her new wealth and her freedom that widowhood afforded her to become one of the greatest sportswomen of the time. So she was extremely accomplished. She was a balloonist, a parachute jumper, a fencer, tobogganist, skier, rifle and pistol shot, and horse trainer. In addition to all of that, she was also a concert pianist and singer. So she was extremely, they call him a Renaissance man. She's a Renaissance woman. She was described as daring and ambitious, or an all or nothing kind of person. Contemporary accounts say that she loved and detested in equal measure. She was the second woman in France to get a driver's license in 1901 and was one of 2 women to enter a race from Paris to Berlin. Dugast in that race went from 122nd place, which was dead last, to finish in 33rd place. However, she was very disappointed in that result and vowed to do better. So she unfortunately didn't have a lot of opportunity to do better before France outlawed women driving in auto races in 1904. Not to be deterred, she turned to motorboat racing instead. She competed in her first race on the River Seine at Juvisy-sur-Orge, and I'm very sorry to anybody who speaks French, which is near Paris. And that was right away in 1904, so she didn't even miss a beat. And her boat was called La Turquoise, a Tellier, Fils and Girard hull fitted with a 6-cylinder Panhard motor of 150 horsepower. Now, she didn't finish this race, but she was spotlighted by the press for her attention-grabbing outfit. And you can kind of see it a little bit in this picture here, but if we go back a few slides, you would have seen that was her costume that she was wearing. Her next race was from Algiers to Toulon, and she commissioned a 43-foot steel hull boat named Camille after herself. Unfortunately, though, there was a storm that blew up, and a lot of the boats either sank or did not finish and had to be taken under tow. And her boat itself ended up almost sinking, and she and her crew had to be rescued by passing sailors. And she later would send 10,000 francs to the sailor that pulled her out of the water. 2 months after the race, she was declared the winner of it because she had made it the furthest before sinking. So Dugast continued her adventures until 1910. She was known as the Amazon and the Valkyrie of the motor car. But in 1910, her daughter hired a gang to murder her in order to gain her inheritance. So they broke into her home, but she was able to fend off the gang that had broken into her home, and instead, because she was so heartbroken by her daughter's betrayal, she devoted her life to charity. She was part of the French Society for the Prevention of Cruelty Towards Animals, and she provided health care to disadvantaged women and children, and that's something she continued to do up until World War II. She also was very prominent in the Women's Organization for Women's Rights and Voting, and was asked to go to Morocco several times by the French government, and did a lot while she was there to promote the image of France in Morocco. She passed away in 1942 at the age of 73, and she was honored with a street name in Paris, and she's actually one of the few women who have had that honor in her own right and not as the wife of somebody important. The next woman we want to look at is Dorothy Levitt, who was born Elizabeth Levi in 1882 in London to a prosperous jeweler. Their last name was anglicized to Levitt from Levi. In 1902, she was working as a secretary for Napier & Sons, who manufactured luxury cars, when she met Selwyn Edge, who drove the Napier cars in races and as promotion. He saw something in her and hired her as his personal secretary, and arranged for her to go to Paris to train and get an apprenticeship with an automaker so that she could learn all the ins and outs of motors and cars and motor racing. And she would often drive Napier & Sons cars and Selwyn Edge's cars for promotion. Upon her return to London, she taught women how to drive, and allegedly this included Queen Alexandra and her daughters. And then in 1905, And then she was caught speeding in Hyde Park and was charged £5, which which was kind of unfair because men at the time who were getting charged with the same thing were only charged £2. So it's kind of unfair. And at one point, she held the ladies' land world speed record. Leavitt wasn't just interested in racing on land, she also had an interest in racing on water. In 1903, she won the inaugural Harmsworth Trophy. Edge's name was on the trophy since he was the one who owned the boat, but he never downplayed her contribution to the win and recognized her as the driver. And as such, she's also the first, she's the person who set the very first water speed record at 19.3 miles per hour, and she did this in a 40-foot steel-hulled Napier boat. She kept on winning more and more records that year and had a lead foot on land and in water, and this earned her the nickname the fastest girl in the world. Leavitt may also have been a pilot. We do know that she attended classes in France, and she did speak of her experiences, but there's no record that she ever qualified to fly. In 1909, Leavitt published The Woman and the Car, and this was meant to counter gendered stereotypes of mechanically ignorant females. So in the book, she taught women all they needed to know about maintenance and driving, etc. And in fact, pioneered the early rear view mirror. 7 years before manufacturers adopted the concept, she advised women to carry a little pocket mirror and then hold it up occasionally to glance behind them as they were driving along, just to check what was happening behind them. From 1910 on, not too much is known about what she was doing. In 1912, her name appears on a byline of a newspaper article, but in 1922, she was found dead in bed. The cause of death was misadventure. She had been suffering from heart disease and an attack of the measles and was self-administering morphine to kind of handle this, and accidentally overdosed from morphine poisoning. Our next racer is Delphine Dodge. She was born on February 11th, 1899 in Detroit, Michigan, and she was the daughter of Horace Elgin Dodge, who was one of the founders of the Dodge Motor Company. She and her older brother, Horace Dodge Jr., shared motorboat racing as a passion. Jr. founded Dodge Boat and Plane Company, and our museum actually has one of the Dodge Boat and Plane Company boats named Garbo, and it's worth a visit to the museum if you haven't already seen it. And both of them would continue to race each other and race as the years went on. But they were very close. Horace Dodge Jr. named his racing boats Delphine after her and also named a daughter after her. She married 3 times and had 2 daughters during her lifetime. She was divorced once and widowed once. And she kind of was known for her social excesses. So she was described as daring and having impressive skills. She was the first woman to win the President's Cup Regatta and was presented the trophy by President Coolidge, which is a photo you can see there. Her racing career, though, was often overshadowed by that excessive lifestyle she had and her marriages. She never slowed down. She kept going. Eventually, though, those life excesses did catch up with her. She died at the age of 43 in 1943 with her 3rd husband by her side. Next, we're going to look at Jo Carstairs. Jo was born February 1st, 1900 in London as Marion Barbara Carstairs. Her mother was an heiress, the daughter of Jabez Bostwick, the co-founder of Standard Oil. Her relationship with her mother, though, was pretty rough, and at age 11, Jo started balking at wearing feminine clothing, and that's when she really wanted to start being called Jo. So her mother sent her to a boarding school in Connecticut in order, for her rebellion, hoping it would straighten her out. Didn't work, though, and in World War I, she lied about her age in order to become an ambulance driver in France. And it was during her stint as an ambulance driver that she met Dolly Wilde, who is the niece of Oscar Wilde, and Dolly becomes her first lover. The list of lovers in Joe's life would continue to become impressive, including Greta Garbo, Tallulah Bankhead, and Marlene Dietrich. She would also have a number of jobs after the war, including helping burying the war dead and also being involved driving troops during the Irish War of Rebellion. So, at the age of 18, Jo married Count Jacques Duprat, who was her childhood friend, in order to gain access to her trust fund and possibly to irk her mother. It was rumored that her mother and Jacques had been lovers. The marriage was quickly annulled after the death of her mother, though, on the grounds of non-consummation, and Jacques and Jo amicably split her inheritance. In 1920, she founded Garage X, which was a chauffeur and car service, and it had all female drivers and mechanics, and that kind of made it well known in London, and it was the exclusive car service for the Savoy Hotel in London. In 1925, she inherited the rest of her Standard Oil money, and that's when she builds her first speedboat. She named it Gwen after one of her lovers, and she won the Southampton Water Trophy in it. In 1925, Jo was gifted a Steiff doll, and it was a present from her girlfriend Ruth Baldwin. She named it Lord Todd Wadley and took him with her everywhere. She had his name put on the nameplate of their London apartment so that it read Jo Carstairs and Lord Todd Wadley, and had his clothing made along with hers on Savile Road, or Savile Row. And Savile Row is kind of historically known in London as like the premier spot for tailoring. So she wasn't afraid to spend money on Lord Todd. Now, unlike Garwood, who you might remember raced with his bears Teddy and Bruin, with him always, she never raced with Lord Todd in her boat because she was afraid of losing him. Jo went on to win many, many trophies between 1925 and 1930, but she never could win the Harmsworth Cup. In 1928, she traveled to Detroit in order to race Garwood in Estelle 2, but unfortunately her boat capsized on the first lap. She attempted to continue to win the Harmsworth Trophy between 1928, 1929, and in 1930, and she was unsuccessful every time. She spent about $500,000 altogether trying to win that race, which is an astronomical amount of money in today's money. Around this time, the American press started referring to her as Betty, and she really disliked this and found it very disrespectful towards her. You can actually hear her own words on the subject if you on YouTube. There's a video of her audio recordings, and she talks about this, and it was something that really upset her. In 1934, Carstairs purchased Whale Key in the Bahamas and built a house, hospital, wireless station, lighthouse, school, church, and cannery on the island. And this is the factory. It's a factory where canned food is canned. She would also add Bird Key, Cat Key, and Devil's Key to her holdings eventually. And she ran them like a ruler, calling herself the Queen of Whale Cay. She employed Bahamians to work fruit plantations and to serve on her army, and she was extremely strict with them. So monogamy was expected, and if they were caught committing adultery, they were banished. Even though she herself was not monogamous, she was just astounded that they would go against their marriage vows. So if you were caught committing adultery, you were kicked off her island. In 1937, Ruth, who had given her Lord Todd Wadley, passed away of an overdose, and Carstairs kept her ashes in a shrine that she built into the church on the island. This picture here is of Whale Key in 2018, and you can kind of see these little white dots in the middle of the island, and that's where the buildings that Jo built were. They've kind of fallen into disrepair at this point. So Carstairs invited many guests to be on her island, but she did not like uninvited visitors. And so there's one instance where a group of American tourists rode to the island, and she captured them, had them bound, and held in the lighthouse overnight before she released them. In 1939, she began her love affair with Marlene Dietrich, and she was so enamored of Marlene that she offered her whale key as a gift. And Dietrich declined, but that just kind of goes to show how much she was in love with Dietrich, because she offered her kingdom, basically. Also, while living on the island, she composed poetry under the names Hans Bernstein. During World War II, Jo built a deep water harbor for the Royal Navy to use, and when an American ship was torpedoed off the coast of the island, she ran an overnight rescue of 46 sailors to save them. And it's funny, well, not funny, but they didn't realize she was a woman until they got back to the island and were kind of stunned. And she did this rescue all the while avoiding U-boats, so it was pretty daring. In 1975, Carstairs sold Whale Key and moved to Florida. And while she was there, she built airports and headed up a steamship company. She anticipated that a memoir of her life might be written, and so she kept recordings of herself reminiscing about her life. And like I mentioned, you can listen to some of those recordings on YouTube. It's very interesting. The memoir was never made, though. In 1993, at the age of 93, Jo Carstairs passed away. She was cremated along with her beloved companion, Lord Todd Wadley, and their ashes, along with Ruth Baldwin's, were buried in New York. In the 1950s, there was kind of a resurgence of the cult of domesticity. After the war, there was like this push to return to like traditional values, and so it was kind of expected that women should stay at home. So racing and everything kind of just slowed, like racing and women in racing kind of really slowed down. They weren't really at the forefront at this time. But in the 1960s, women came back to racing. Lady Violet Atkin, who was known as the first lady of offshore racing, she caught the racing bug when driving her husband's boat back from somewhere he was unable to do it. And so she bought her own boat called Ultraviolet. And today her granddaughter carries on the family tradition and races in a boat called the Lady Vi. In the 1970s, Betty Cook, who was an American, was just dismissed as a rich housewife looking to while away the hours, but she went on to win the first Powerboat World Championship and then 16 more races. So she wasn't just a housewife. She was doing lots of great things. And then in the 1980s, Fiona Gore, who was the Countess of Arran, became the fastest woman on water at 102 miles per hour. It's important to note that like women have never reached the levels that men have in terms of numbers of racing, but they have always been involved in racing and to this day continue to be involved in racing, and women participation is at its all-time high. These are just a few books that if you're interested in some further reading: The Queen of Whale Key, The Eccentric Story of Jo Carstairs, the fastest woman on water. There's also Eat My Dust, Early Women Motorists, Taking the Wheel, Women and the Coming of the Motor Age, and then Fast Ladies, Female Racing Drivers. These are just some books that will give you a little bit more insight on the topic, as well as the kind of history behind everything. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We hope you enjoyed this, and if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us here at the Legacy of the Lakes Museum. Thank you.